They branded her at dawn, when the frost still clung to the wooden posts and the town square, smelled of cold iron and fear, and no one noticed how her hands shook, not from guilt, but from the quiet terror of knowing that once a lie is burned into flesh, it becomes truth to everyone else. And Eliza stood there with her dark hair tangled by the wind, her dress torn at the hem, her boots stolen the night before so her feet bled against the frozen dirt. And she kept telling herself not to cry because crying would make them believe she was weak, and weakness was the same as guilt in a place like Red Hollow, where mercy had been buried long before the railroad ever came. And the sheriff read the accusation in a voice that echoed off the saloon. Walls, thief, liar, vagrant, each word heavier than the last, while the crowd murmured like a hungry animal, remembering the missing silver, the vanished payroll money, the coin that had disappeared from the locked chest inside the McRae ranch house. And Eliza thought of how she had been dragged from the servants' quarters before sunrise, not even allowed to put on her coat, how Mrs. McRae had looked at her with eyes colder than the brand itself, already convinced, already absolved of doubt, because it was easier to blame the quiet girl with no family than to look too closely at one's own blood. And when the iron touched her shoulder, she bit down hard enough to taste blood, refusing to scream because the scream would belong to them forever. And in that moment, she did not see the man on horseback at the edge of the square, watching with a face carved from stone, his hat pulled low, his eyes sharp and unreadable, a cowboy named Caleb McRae, who had ridden in late the night before after weeks on the trail, unaware that the town was about to burn his name into a woman's skin for a crime she did not commit. And as the brand hissed and smoke rose, Caleb's jaw tightened, not because he believed her innocent, not yet, but because something in the way she stood, rigid and silent, reminded him of his mother, the day she had been blamed for his father's debts and driven out with nothing but shame. And the crowd cheered when it was done, because cruelty always feels like justice when shared. And Eliza collapsed to her knees, the pain blooming white-hot across her shoulder, and the sheriff declared the matter settled, the town cleansed, the thief marked for life, while Mrs. McRae turned away, already satisfied, her son Thomas pale and sweating beside her. And no one noticed how Thomas wouldn't meet Eliza's eyes, how his hands shook as if he were the one burned. And Caleb watched it all in silence, committing every detail to memory, the way a man does when something inside him has begun to itch, because Caleb knew the locks on that house, knew the habits of every man and woman under that roof, knew who drank too much and who lied too easily. And though he said nothing as Eliza was hauled to her feet and pushed from the square like refuse, something followed her in his gaze, something unresolved, and later that morning when he returned to the ranch, the house felt wrong to him, not because of what had happened in town, but because guilt has a sound, if you know how to listen. A restless creak in the floorboards, a door that closes too softly, a silence that lingers too long. And as he dismounted and handed the reins to a stable boy, Caleb noticed the chest where the silver had been kept now sat unlocked, too clean, as if wiped in a hurry. And he asked the housekeeper a simple question, who last touched it, and she hesitated, just a breath too long before answering Eliza, and Caleb nodded but did not believe her. Because Eliza had always been careful, always counted twice, always feared being accused of something she hadn't done. And that fear does not belong to thieves, it belongs to the innocent. And when Caleb went to his brother Thomas's room, he found him drunk before noon, muttering, hands shaking, a thin line of blood where he'd bitten his lip. And on the floor beneath the bed, hidden poorly, lay a silver coin, and Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. Because truth does not arrive loudly, it arrives quietly and waits to be acknowledged. And in that moment, Caleb understood that the real thief was not the girl branded in the square, but someone hiding in his own house, protected by name and blood. And as the sun climbed higher and Eliza limped down the road with nowhere to go and everyone staring at the mark that would follow her forever, Caleb McRae made a decision that would tear his family apart and set a town on fire. Because justice, once awakened, does not care who it burns. And if you want to know how a lie unravels and a branded woman finds her voice again, Make sure you subscribe to this channel, because the next chapter will change everything. By the time night fell over, Red Hollow, the brand on Eliza's shoulder, had stopped smoking but not burning, and she walked with the stiff, careful steps of someone learning how to carry pain without letting it own her. Every lantern she passed casting the shadow of the mark, larger against the ground, as if the town itself wanted to remind her of what they had decided she was, and she did not know that far behind her. Riding hard with dust in his teeth and anger in his chest, Caleb McRae was following the truth like a blood trail. Because once a man sees the shape of a lie, he cannot unsee it. And Caleb replayed the morning again and again, the way Thomas wouldn't look at her, the way his hands shook, the coin under the bed like a confession, whispered too loudly, and when he reached the edge of town where Eliza had finally collapsed beside a dry creek bed, feverish and half-conscious, he dismounted without thinking of reputation or consequence and wrapped her in his coat, lifting her as gently as if she were something fragile the world had already broken too many times. And when she woke hours later in the ranch's old line shack, firelight dancing on the walls, her first instinct was fear, because kindness after cruelty feels like another trick. But Caleb did not touch her beyond offering water and salve, and he told her in a low voice that she was safe for the night. And when she tried to confess again, words tumbling out in desperation, he stopped her, not because he believed her guilty, but because he already knew she was innocent. And innocence does not need to beg. And Eliza stared at him then with something like disbelief, because no one had ever said those words to her without condition. And Caleb left before dawn, riding back to the house with a plan that tasted like betrayal and justice all at once. And inside that house, Thomas was unraveling, drinking deeper, lying worse, because lies rot from the inside out. And when Caleb confronted him, quietly at first, Thomas denied it with the practiced ease of a man who had never been held accountable, blaming Eliza, blaming bad luck, blaming everyone but himself, until Caleb placed the silver coin on the table between them, and the room went silent except for Thomas's breathing. And blood does not protect you when truth stands tall. And Caleb demanded the rest, demanded the truth, demanded that Thomas ride into town and confess before the mark on. Eliza's skin became her grave, and Thomas laughed then, brittle and cruel, saying the town would never believe a branded woman over a McRae. And in that moment, Caleb understood the real cost of silence. Because by doing nothing, he had helped brand her too. And he struck his brother not in rage, but in finality, knocking him to the floor and binding his hands. And when dawn came again, Red Hollow gathered for another spectacle, expecting nothing more than gossip, until Caleb rode into the square with Thomas tied across his saddle and Eliza walking beside him, wrapped in his coat, standing straighter than she had the day before. And the sheriff tried to speak, but Caleb cut him off, throwing the silver onto the dirt piece by piece, each clink like a hammer on glass, and Thomas broke then, sobbing, confessing, naming every lie. Every night he'd stolen and blamed the servant girl because it was easy and safe. And the town's certainty cracked, because certainty is fragile when built on convenience, and Mrs. McRae screamed, not for Eliza but for her son, but it was too late. Because truth once spoken cannot be unspoken, and the sheriff ordered Thomas jailed. And the same crowd that had cheered the brand now stood silent, unable to look at Eliza's shoulder, and Caleb turned to her and did what no one expected. He knelt, publicly, and apologized, not just for the brand, but for the silence that allowed it. And Eliza felt something loosen in her chest then. Not forgiveness yet, but release, because the lie no longer owned her, and though the brand would scar, it would not define her. And as the days passed, the town tried to make amends in awkward ways. Food left at doors, eyes lowered in shame. But Eliza did not stay in Red Hollow, because healing does not always mean staying where you were hurt. And she rode away with Caleb not as a savior's prize, but as a woman choosing her own future, carrying her pain and her strength side by side. And the story of the branded thief became the story of the truth that burned hotter than iron. And if this story moved you, if you believe justice matters even when it's uncomfortable, subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories where truth rises, silence breaks, and the forgotten are finally seen.